welcome to the channel. Today's video is about the M140i, and in particular this one belonging to one of our customers. It has the legendary B58 engine, and for you guys that are into BMWs or into tuning, you will know about the massive tuning potential that this engine has. This car we've looked after for a few years now. It's in for an oil change today and actually having the iDrive updated. But whilst we've got it, we wanted to go over what's been done to the car and what sort of performance it's able to produce. Looking under the engine bay, this car looks relatively standard. If we look here, you can see it's got an MST intake fitted on it. If you've got quite a sharp eye, you may notice that this is not standard. But other than that, looking around the engine bay, it looks relatively standard. If we look down on this corner, it's possible to tell that it's got a decap pipe on it, but there ain't too much given away to what's actually been done to this car. Before tuning, we do our best to make sure that the cars are healthy before touching them. We do this through diagnostic scans, the pre-tuning dyno runs and a visual inspection. When doing a visual inspection, one of the things that's top of my list for checking is making sure that this coolant tank has fluid in it, because they can get leaks and they don't bring up an engine management light when they do so. The other thing is finding out how old the spark plugs are. If they're original plugs and they're ungapped, when tuning or soon after tuning, it's quite common to develop a misfire. So making sure that you've got good plugs that are gapped correctly can help prevent that. So this car will be what I consider FBO, full bolt on. But before the guy got to this stage, he done the smaller mods. He done it level by level by level and got the car eventually to where it's at now. So what happens if you just map the ECU, don't change anything on the car, you're probably going to end up with about 430, 440 brake horsepower. If you want to go for stage 2, which means taking off the catalytic converter, you normally see about 460 brake horsepower when you do that. Some might make a bit less, some might make a bit more. The last one we done I think made 466, but that's the rough number of where you're going to be when you take the cat off. There is another step on tuning these that is usually called stage 2 plus. That means switching over the fuel pump. So you use the newer 350 bar pump, or you might use a Dorch pump, but basically you're using a better fuel pump because the standard one crashes when you try to run too much power. If you do that, the last one we done we took to 488, and some cars are even seeing 500 brake with that fuel pump changed over. So that's the 3 most common stages of tuning on these. Stage 1, stage 2, stage 2 plus. Alright, so enough about talking about these other cars, let's talk about this car. So, why is this one faster? What's been changed on it? So we already know it's got a decap, it's got an uprated high pressure fuel pump. What else has it got? Why is it faster? Well, the first thing that's on it, and what makes most of the power, is this turbo. So this is the Pure 800 turbo. There are now 2 versions of that turbo. One is a full cast, which is completely different compressor and exhaust housings. It's much bigger and it makes a ton of power. And then the earlier ones was the Pure 800 and the Pure 850. This has got the Pure 800 on it. It's quite a responsive fast turbo, but it doesn't produce quite the amount of power that some of these bigger turbos can now produce. The second mod on it, and the other one that makes quite a big difference, is here. This is a fuel rail for methanol. This one is meth injected as well. So we're able to push a lot more air into the engine, and we're able to push a lot more higher quality, colder fuel into the engine as well. Methanol contains oxygen molecules, it burns cooler, it contains higher octane, and it basically is like you having 95 and having 99. Call this 110. This makes a huge difference to the car. So, if we come around to the back, you will see, oh my god, what are those? No meth tank. So what we've done with this one is we've fitted it here. So you might be looking at this and you might think it's a bit of an unfamiliar setup. So that is a F10M5 stealth meth tank, and this is a lithium race battery. So putting those both there like that, the back of the boot looks a lot cleaner and you haven't got a massive meth tank there giving away the game. So what sort of difference does the methanol make? You may be thinking of putting a hybrid turbo on, but you don't really want that methanol kit on there as well. You might be thinking of using ethanol instead, race fuel, or you just want to keep it on petrol. Well, this car had the turbo before it had the meth kit, and when it was on that, it was making about 600 brake, and 100 to 200 on it was low 60s, 6.1, 6.2, those sort of times. Once we fitted the methanol kit on it, We gained 100 brake on the dyno and 100 to 200 times dropped down to 5.5. So it made a big difference on this particular car. That Pure 800, like I said, is one of the smaller turbos out there. So you could go for the new Pure 800, you could go for the door, you could go for the 850, and you'll be able to pump them numbers down even more. This video predominantly so far has been about hardware, but obviously software is a massive part of it as well. You may be sat there as an owner of one of these cars going, do I get a custom map? Do I put an off-the-shelf on? Do I use BootMod3? Do I use MHD? Do I use NG Flasher? Everyone's saying that the way they've done it's the best, but I don't really know what the differences are between them or which one to use. So to give you some information on this car that might help with your decision, this car was originally flashed without any of the platforms. So we used one of our own tools, which is called a B-Flash, and then we used our software on the laptop called Windows, load up the binary file, made the changes that we wanted to make, load them into the ECU, and then the customer was able to take the car away. But as you add turbos and fuel pumps and meth kits and want to run ethanol, you want to do all this crazy stuff, that's when you might need to have a bit more flexibility. You might want a map switch, for example, you might want a data log, you might want to turn the burbles on and off. There's loads and loads of customization that comes on those platforms. So we chose to move this one onto BootMod3. He's got all our velocity tunes on there, but he can switch between which one he wants to use. He might not like the way that I set up his burbles or his pops and bangs, or he might just want to take them off. He can now control all of that. So the BootMod3 platform is really good. I see quite a lot of cars on MHD as well. That's a good platform. This particular car now is running our custom software via BootMod3, and of course when he got the license he's still got a free map as well, so he's got their off-the-shelf stage 2 hybrid file that he can use sort of as a bass tune if he doesn't want to make too much power. Some other small things that are good about BootMod and these other platforms as well is if he wants to put this car back to standard, even though he's got a different fuel pump which needs its own calibration, the Dorch, he can put this car to standard with the Dorch calibration still written into it. He can turn his cold start on or off, and he's got so much control over this car now. So as somebody that owns and uses a dyno all day, the biggest gauge of power for me is not actually the dyno. I see a lot of companies quoting figures that might be higher or lower than my own, and it doesn't really give me a gauge of how fast their cars are compared to ones that say we've built. So one thing I do like to look at is draggy numbers and how they perform on the road. Things like 100 to 200 kilometers, 60 to 130 mile an hour, quarter mile, all that sort of stuff, I think gives a better understanding, because all different dynos read differently, and all vehicles, the weight of them, the way the transmissions geared, all of that can make a huge difference. So this car on its best map runs a 5.5. That would be like an M3 M4 with a hybrid and a turbo. For example, a 750 brake F10 M5 would be doing on average 6.3, 6.4, 100 to 200. So this is actually faster than a lot of stage 2 F10 M5s. I'd say a stage 2 F90 M5 will produce similar results on a strong tune, but I think those numbers give you a bit of understanding of how fast this car is. So this car with 700 brake will perform like a big heavy family car with 800 brake horsepower. So to make sure this car's the full package, it's not just about power. There's other things you want to be doing to this car to make it the full package and so that it can handle the power and stop. You want to upgrade the brakes, you want to put an LSD in the back, you might put coilovers on or M4 lower control arms to make it handle better. You don't really want to just go push this car up to 700 brake and not touch anything else on it, because you won't be able to put most of it down and it's going to be real sketchy. The thing I like about these cars is the engines, for one, are a lot stronger than a lot of other BMW engines, and for what the car costs and the mods cost, you're not going to get this amount of power for the same price. It's really good bang for buck. Come on. Earlier I touched on off-the-shelf maps, custom maps and BootMod, MHD, NG Flasher, and I don't really have no information on which one of those produces the most power out of the off-the-shelf maps, but as a tuner, Boot 3 gets it hands down for me because it really helps creating maps remotely, and the data logging functions just work in my opinion. But what I do have some information on is the differences between our custom maps and the off-the-shelf maps. So all these numbers are on my dyno, so other dynos may read higher or lower, so just use it as a delta game between. But we done a stage 2 car, and the car that we done made 466 brake horsepower stage 2. A little while after, the customer wanted us to fit a TU pump, so we done that, and at the same time he wanted to have the boot mod option so that he could adjust his burbles and whatnot. So we done that, and it came with an off-the-shelf map, stage 2 plus. So we loaded the stage 2 plus on, and it made 2 brake more than us. It made 468, but it made about 20 newton meters more torque through the mid-range. So even though the brake horsepower looks the same, the stage 2 plus would have been faster on the road because it had a much better curve through the mid-range because it could keep the fuel in there. So we then done a custom stage 2 plus map, and our brake horsepower was 488, so we gained about 20 brake on top of them, and then we gained 35 newton meters of torque on top of their stage 2 plus map. So now the car pulls really strong through the whole RPM, and it never really lets off. What people used to say with these cars is, if they would have raced their friend at stage 2 and they're on a stage 2 plus map, they'd have a lot more torque, but right up at the top end they sort of equaled out. By doing a custom map, we're able to get a lot more torque but also get a lot more brake horsepower as well. The differences between these numbers are not night and day. It's not like I'm saying a off-the-shelf map will make 400 brake and a custom map will make 500 brake. But with a custom map, of course, you can dial it in for each car, and you can push a bit more aggressively because you can log the parameters, make sure it's safe, and fine-tune it for that particular vehicle. That's so good. I love this car. Oh, I wish I had one of these. These are so fun. As I've said 101 times, this car does 5.500 to 200. What's funny about that is actually my personal car, the F90 M5, that also does about a 5.500 to 200 on stage 2. But I tell you something, it's 10 times more fun in this, trying to hang on and control it, as opposed to just having an X-Drive system propel you forward. It's a completely different ball game. If you're driving a car to get some enjoyment from it and have some fun, this is not a bad way to spend your money.
This is the last section of the video, and for any of you guys that are a bit geeky or interested on how the ECU works on these cars, this is the section for you. So we've got our tuning software loaded up. We have a 140i file here, and all these little squiggles are all the different maps within the ECU. So that can be ignition timing, for example, right there. It could be fueling, could be torque, could be the cold start, the burbles, could be tons of different things. They're all in here, and there's literally thousands and thousands of maps. So we're looking at this in a 2D view, but if we flick across like that, you can look at it in hexadecimal as well. We're going to keep it as 2D for now, and then here is some of the maps that are within the ECU, some of the ones that I actually want to talk about. Like I say, there's a lot more that are available and need to be adjusted, but just to explain how the ECU works, these are going to cover that. So you'd probably imagine that the way this ECU works is at a given throttle or RPM, a certain amount of boost is being requested. These don't actually work off of boost, they work off of load and torque. So there are some boost maps, but they're mainly like boost limiters, and it's the load and torque that you actually got to focus on. So load is a calculation of things like ignition timing, Lambert, Vanos, boost and throttle, and using all of those systems together, which all affect power, you can come up with a load target. If I click here, you'll see one of the load target maps. So you've got engine RPM across the top, and you've got load across the bottom. If you look, we're requesting 185 until we get to 5,500 RPM, and it starts to taper down. If we look at it in this view, you can see as we get to 5.5, that figure becomes lower. If I go down, the other part of this system I was mentioning is torque, and the table looks pretty similar. We're requesting 500. Now that's in Newton meters, and then as we get down to about 4750, we start to taper down the torque request until we end up at 333 at 7000 RPM. If I flip it over into this display, you'll see it actually looks pretty similar to the way that the load table looks. Now, load and torque work together and do a calculation of each other, and that calculation is done here. If we have a look, we have engine RPM across the top, we've got load down this left side, and then the main Z axis is Newton meters. And if we flick these back over to text, and we find our other little map, minimize that for a second, pull that over. The screen's quite small compared to what I usually use, but it's good enough to explain how this works. If we have a look at, say, 5,500 RPM, we request 434 Newton meters. So if we go over to 5.5 here, go down to this section here, and that would be where that's being requested. Look across, and you can see that you've got between 110 and 130 on the load. If we look at the load cap here, you'll see that 5.5, that's set to 172. So you've got some headroom there. It's going to be able to request that. Now, for example, if I was to try to make more power, and so instead of asking for 434, I ask for 700 Newton meters. Do that again. There we are. If I was to do that and set it to 700, we're already scaled for that, so we haven't gone off the chart. But if we go down, we'll find that we're now in this area, and that takes us to load values of between 180 and 200. But looking at the load now, it's not set high enough. It's only set to 172, so you need to increase that value as well. And there's quite a lot of torque maps and load maps. So it's not just these ones, there's other ones throughout the ECU, and you need to go through them all properly, otherwise you're going to find that they get in the way of you making the power you want to make. So once you've got this set up, you're going to find that there's other maps that are involved in this system as well. For example, ignition timing is based off of it. Got engine RPM across the top, you've got load down here. So if we look at that 5.5 value again, and we was to look at that load of when the car was standard, come across, you're going to see that the car's requesting somewhere between 16 and 18 degrees of ignition timing. Once you increase the load so that you'd be hitting up into that 180 mark, for example, you're going to see that it's actually taking ignition out, and that's because you're going to be running a lot more boost and you're not going to need as much ignition to make the power. It's also important to recalibrate this if you are putting more load in. So for example, these numbers can actually go really high. You can recalibrate the ECU for more load, you can calibrate the ECU for more torque, for example, set all these numbers higher, and then the good thing about doing it that way is the gearbox will see the correct values. So instead of just changing one, not the other, you want to do them both together. So looking at that, that explains how the ignition timing is working. And Lambda, you can see you've got Newton meters on the side here. So a value of 1, for example, would be stoichiometric, so like a 9 of 14.7 if you're on normal petrol. And then as we work our way down the Newton meters, requesting more, you can see that it's going for richer mixtures. There's a ton of Lambda tables and there's a ton of ignition tables, all for different situations. If you've got something like a hybrid turbo on, you may find that you want to change the way that it's generating its boost. So if the car's over boosting or under boosting, you'd be looking at areas like this, which is the PID system for the wastegate. So if it does over or under boost, it has its own closed loop system where it can adjust that. And if you find that you're off target or that you're getting pulsating effects, these are the sort of places that you want to be looking. So once you're adjusting these maps, you want to be data logging as well, and then you can see if you've got throttle closures or if you're over or under targeting, and you can basically adjust everything again and again until you're happy with where you're at. Things like burbles are all adjusted in these areas here. So you can see you've got lots and lots of different maps, and that can be for like minimum and maximum speed, duration, the amount of ignition that's being put in when it's being activated, and what else did we want to go through? Speed limiters for the engine. All these are different engine speed limiters, and finally, an important one for most people, the Vmax speed limiter. So most cars are limited to 155. This is where that's raised. So I think that gives a good overview of how this ECU works. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video. Hopefully what I'm going on about makes some sort of sense. If there's anything in particular that you're more interested in and you want to know about, give us a shout. But for now, that is the end of this